Well, hello everybody. Oh boy, today was awfully difficult for me to get up and get out and do something, but I finally dragged myself out. I really don't feel like doing anything too involved today. Some days you have days like that, and today is definitely one of those days. So basically what I'm going to do is I'm going to have another go at some ICM photography. Because with ICM photography, obviously, you don't necessarily have to have that perfect subject so much. And on a day like today, it's a bit overcast. We're getting some sunlight here and there. But with ICM photography, it gives you quite a bit of leeway, actually. Things don't have to be exactly perfect. And a lot of the times you can come up with some pretty interesting images. So I'm going to have another go at that today and see how things turn out. I'm not actually going to vlog the entire process of taking the photographs today. I'm going to go ahead, take the photographs, and then I'll share those later with you after I process them. All right, so I'll see you in a few. Okay. All right, I got a chance to take a few images, and I'd like to share those images with you right now and kind of walk you through the process of what I did to create them. All right. Now, this first image that I have here, this was, as I said earlier, an ICM image, and it was pretty basic. I really didn't do a whole lot special to it as far as taking the actual image. Most of the magic, so to speak, came in the post-processing. Basically, what I did with this is pretty much what I do with the vast majority of the images that I take. It was basically, it's either going to be a subtle up movement or a down movement. I experiment a lot of the times with going through a full range up and down, but a lot of the times that doesn't seem to work very well. So I basically stuck with that. And the settings for this were actually ISO 100, 52 millimeters, f-stop 22, and about 1/6 of a second. And this was the end result. Now, as always, I did the initial processing in Lightroom, and then did the final processing in Photoshop. And in Photoshop, basically all I did was manipulate the hue and saturation sliders until I got a look that I was happy with. Okay, one thing I've also noticed is that a lot of the time when I'm processing these images, I experimented with giving it a Gaussian blur. It works well on some images, but for my personal preference, I think a lot of the time, simply sharpening it and bringing out fine detail in the streaks as it's moving up and down tends to work very well. And that's what I stick with the majority of the time. All right, this next one is just the black and white version of the same image. This was also processed actually mainly in Lightroom. And pretty much about the only thing I did here was give it more contrast. And I did use the local adjustment brushes to deal with the darker areas here. And also the lighter areas to increase the highlights, to give it a little bit more depth, a bit more range. All right, now this next image is one that I tried quite a few different variations of, and I finally decided on this. I decided to kind of shorten it. I wanted to initially do something like maybe a 16 by 9 vertical crop on this, but it was including too much of the sky, and it didn't have something just didn't look right about it. Sometimes you're processing images and you look at it and something just isn't right about it. So I decided on this. What I did was I cut off, basically shortened it, and eliminated most of the sky. Now, if you look in these areas here, the blue areas, this is actually portions of the sky that actually peeked through as the camera was being moved. And I rather liked this because it gave a wider range of colors, everything going from yellow all the way down to red. And I did the same thing with this as well. I did the post-processing in Photoshop and manipulated the hue and saturation sliders. Now, I experimented with the Gaussian blur on this as well, but I wasn't quite happy with it. The Gaussian blur took away too much of the detail, and detail tends to be my preference when it comes to images of this nature. And as with the last image, here is an abstract black and white version of that, and this was mainly processed in Lightroom as well. And I did use the local adjustment brushes to reduce the exposure in the darker areas, as you can see here. And also I used the local adjustment brushes to bring out the highlights in the lighter areas. And I think this works relatively well as another black and white abstract image. All right, the settings for this were ISO 100, and it was shot at 40 millimeters, f-stop 22, and about 1/8 of a second. And usually when I take these shots, they're basically just very, very subtle movements. I found that moving the camera a lot of times too much doesn't tend to yield the best results. But of course, with ICM photography, you're taking a ridiculous number of shots just to find just a few shots that might actually work and yield a decent image. And this particular outing was no exception. All right, now this next image is actually my favorite of the ones that I took. I actually came up with 4 shots, and I rather like this. Now, adjacent to the area that I actually took the previous 2 images, there was a creek running just alongside it. So what I did was I got down into the creek itself, and if you look at the top portion of the screen, or of the image rather, you can see how bright it is here. This was actually, the sun was beginning to set, and the sky was illuminated pretty well. And if you look further down below, very little light was reaching the creek bed itself. The trees above it were actually blocking most of the light. Now, when I first looked at this, I said to myself, well, I'd probably like some detail here in this area, which I could have brought out, but I decided that keeping this area completely dark and crushing the blacks in this area would actually work pretty well. It's providing a considerable amount of contrast, obviously. Okay, and as with this, I manipulated the hue and saturation sliders. Now, if you look here over to the left, these were the remnants of some trees that were basically dead, but they were still standing. And we're getting side lighting, and you can see it's illuminating this area here on the tree, and it's actually going all the way up. Okay, and as I said, and if you look here, you can see the greens. These were actually trees in the background, and you also have some color variations between the lighter greens and the darker greens here. And I did actually process 3 different versions of this particular image, and of the 3 that I processed, this was actually my favorite. The 3 color images, rather. And the exposure settings for this were ISO 100. And this was shot at 42 millimeters, f-stop 22, and this was shot at 1.6 seconds. So I gave this a longer exposure, and it really accentuated the streaking effect on this particular image. And as I said, this was my favorite of the ones that I took. And as with the previous 3, here is the black and white version of that. And I rather like this as well. I may actually print this. I rather like this particular image. Color or black and white. Okay. Now, this last final image was actually shot in the same area. I'm still down in the creek. And initially, when I took this image, I wasn't quite sure exactly what to do with it. I wasn't sure if I had an image at all. So I actually let this sit on the back burner for a few days. And then when I came back to it, I was beginning to see a little something. And as you can see, the sun has gotten even lower. And if you look to this area just across here, you can see it's getting darker, and it's getting darker as it goes down. Now, if you look down at the bottom, right here in the foreground, you can actually see a little bit of the water. Now, I did what I could to try and bring that out. And I think it works relatively well. It's not actually one of my favorite images, but I was actually glad that I was able to get something out of it. I think this looks a bit more like an abstract painting. And if you look here, the highlights are pretty obvious as the sun is actually peeking through different areas in the trees. All right. And as with the previous three, there is a black and white version of this. And the settings for this particular image, as with the others, ISO 100. Now, the difference was this particular image, I shot this with an 8mm lens. I took along my APS-C sensor camera, so actually that 8mm was actually about 12mm. If you take in the 1.5 crop factor that you would use with a Nikon camera. Okay, and this was at f-stop 3.5, and I shot this at 1.3 seconds. And like I said, I still have mixed feelings about this particular image, but I don't think it's bad. I'd like to have your opinion on this particular image, as well as the others. I hope you enjoyed the images that I took, and hopefully I can get out and maybe take some more images that are ICM in nature, and perhaps come up with some stuff that's even better than I did. Of course, with ICM photography, it's pretty hit and miss, but I enjoy it. It's really great for a change of pace on days when you don't like sticking to that regular regiment of trying to achieve absolute perfection with your landscape images. So I hope you enjoyed this, and until next time.